On November 4th, 1791, in a frozen meadow on the headwaters of the Wabash River, soldiers of the United States Army lay dead in such numbers that when an American military detachment returned to the battlefield 2 years later, they found bones still scattered across nearly 4 miles of forest road. When the warriors of the Northwestern Confederacy walked among the corpses in the hours after the battle, they performed a ritual that contemporary American sources record with unusual specificity. They knelt beside the dead, and they pushed soil into their mouths, handfuls of cold Ohio earth packed between dead lips. A message written in dirt for the next column of Americans who would come looking for what had happened here. The message was simple. The Americans had wanted land. Now, finally, they had enough. Think about what those numbers mean. Out of approximately 1,400 American soldiers who marched into that meadow, between 630 and 657 were killed. Another 271 were wounded. Of the roughly 200 women and children traveling with the Army, only 3 are recorded to have survived. The total casualty rate exceeded 75%. In some units, it approached 97%. In 3 hours of combat, the United States lost roughly 1/4 of its entire standing army. Contemporary sources on both sides confirm these figures. This was not exaggeration. This was documentation of the worst military disaster in proportional terms that the United States has ever suffered in a single engagement. Compare it to anything you think you know about American military catastrophe. Custer at the Little Bighorn lost 268 men. The Wabash killed nearly 3 times that number. Pearl Harbor's death toll was higher in absolute terms, but it represented a fraction of 1% of American military strength. The Wabash gutted the army of a nation, and it was inflicted by a force that suffered approximately 21 dead and 40 wounded. 61 casualties total against more than 900. A casualty ratio of roughly 15-to-1 in favor of the Confederacy. The kind of mathematics that doesn't happen by accident. By the end of this video, you will understand how a 57-year-old general suffering from gout so severe his aides carried him on a litter walked his army into the most sophisticated tactical trap ever sprung against an American force. I am about to reveal 3 documented facts that rewrote the United States military forever. First, the contracting scandal that ensured the Army was already defeated before it left Cincinnati. Second, the intelligence report on the night of November 3rd that, had it been delivered, would have prevented the disaster entirely. Third, the 15-minute window in which the entire perimeter of an American army was systematically encircled by a pincer maneuver that history calls the half moon. But here is what makes this moment historically extraordinary. How did roughly 1,000 warriors operating without artillery destroy a force half again their size, equipped with 8 field guns? Why did an experienced commander build no fortifications when enemy scouts had been shadowing his column for weeks? How did a logistics scandal in New York translate into bayonets failing in the woods of Ohio? And why does the congressional investigation that followed this battle still shape every conversation about executive power in the United States today? To understand how a meadow on the Wabash River became the grave of an army, we need to step back to 1783 and the diplomatic agreement that lit the fuse on a war the United States did not yet realize it was fighting. These battles were not about strength. They were about adaptation, about whether a young republic could learn that the rules of European warfare did not apply in the forests of the Ohio country. Hit subscribe before we begin. Let us step into the Wabash. The Treaty of Paris, signed September 3, 1783, formally ended the American Revolutionary War. The agreement transferred British territorial claims south of the Great Lakes, west of the Appalachians, and east of the Mississippi to the new United States. On parchment, it looked like a continent handed over by signature. In practice, it was a fiction. The treaty negotiators in Paris had transferred lands they did not control, occupied by peoples they did not consult, in violation of agreements those peoples had never signed. The indigenous nations of what the United States called the Northwest Territory had not surrendered. They had not been defeated. Many of them did not even know the war was over. And when American agents began arriving in the Ohio country in 1784 and 1785 to inform Miami and Shawnee and Delaware leaders that their lands now belonged to a new government 2,000 miles away, the response was something between bewilderment and rage. The American position was articulated through what historians now call the right of conquest doctrine. The reasoning ran like this. The indigenous nations had allied with Britain during the Revolution. Britain had lost. Therefore, the indigenous nations had also lost. Therefore, their lands were forfeit. The logic was elegant in Philadelphia drawing rooms and incomprehensible in the Maumee Valley. Tribal leaders pointed out, with considerable accuracy, that not all indigenous nations had supported Britain, that those who had done so were sovereign actors who had made their own treaties with the Crown, and that the British had no authority to surrender lands they did not own. None of this mattered. The new United States was drowning in Revolutionary War debt. It had soldiers to pay, bondholders to satisfy, foreign loans to service. The single most valuable asset the federal government possessed was Western land. The land had to be sold. To sell it, it had to be cleared. To clear it, the indigenous nations had to go. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784 and the Treaty of Fort McIntosh in 1785 attempted to legitimize this transfer through coerced agreements with small delegations of tribal representatives whose authority to cede land was disputed by the broader indigenous polity. The treaties were rejected almost immediately by the populations they purported to bind. By 1786, a coalition was forming. Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, who had spent the Revolution fighting for the British in New York, traveled west to encourage the formation of a pan-tribal alliance. The result was what the Americans called the Northwestern Confederacy, and what its members called the United Indian Nations. Its founding principle was simple. The Ohio River was the boundary. Anything north and west of that river was indigenous land. Settlers crossing the river were trespassers. Trespassers would be killed. The Confederacy was not a unified nation in the European sense. It had no single ruler, no central capital, no standing army. What it had was something closer to a parliamentary alliance of sovereign peoples, each retaining its own leadership and its own interests, but coordinating on the question of American encroachment. The Miami Nation under their war chief Little Turtle controlled the Kekianga trade complex at the confluence of the St. Joseph and St. Mary's rivers, modern-day Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Shawnee, under Blue Jacket, held the Mad River and Great Miami valleys. The Delaware, displaced from Pennsylvania a generation earlier, had built refugee villages along the Upper Wabash. The Ottawa, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Wyandot, and Mingo each contributed warriors and councils. British traders operating from Detroit, technically illegal under the Treaty of Paris but never withdrawn, supplied muskets, powder, and intelligence. The Confederacy was the most sophisticated indigenous political organization north of Mexico. and the United States chose to underestimate it for almost a decade. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance accelerated everything. The legislation, passed by the Continental Congress, established a formal civilian government for the territory and committed the federal government to creating new states from it. The ordinance also contained Article 3, which promised that indigenous lands would not be taken without consent. The contradiction between Article 3 and the actual policy of forced cessions was so glaring that it convinced Confederacy leaders the Americans could not be negotiated with in good faith. Settler violence escalated in 1788 and 1789. Indigenous raids escalated in response. By 1790, the frontier from Pittsburgh to the Falls of the Ohio was a continuous low-intensity war zone. The Washington administration, sworn in the previous April, faced a choice. Negotiate seriously, which would require abandoning the right of conquest doctrine and recognizing indigenous sovereignty. Or escalate. It chose to escalate. In the autumn of 1790, Brigadier General Josiah Harmar marched approximately 1,400 men north from Fort Washington, the federal post at modern Cincinnati, with orders to destroy the Miami villages around Tequila. The expedition was a calamity. Harmar's force was undisciplined, poorly supplied, and tactically incompetent. Little Turtle's warriors ambushed 2 detachments separately, killed roughly 180 American soldiers, and forced Harmar to retreat in disorder. Confederacy losses were minimal. The strategic message was unambiguous. The American military, as currently constituted, was not capable of winning a war in the Ohio country. The Confederacy emerged from 1790 stronger, more confident, and more unified than it had been at any point in its history. In Philadelphia, the response was a decision that would lead directly to the disaster on the Wabash. The Army would be sent again, larger, under a more senior commander, with a more ambitious objective. And it would be sent with a logistical support system designed by men who saw the war as a business opportunity. The campaign of 1791 was compromised before a single soldier left Fort Washington. The compromise had a name: William Duer. Duer had been Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Alexander Hamilton from 1789 to 1790, the second-ranking financial officer in the United States government. He had resigned in April 1790 because federal law forbade Treasury officials from speculating in federal securities, and Duer had no intention of giving up speculation. He retained, however, the personal connections that mattered. He was 48 years old, English-born, Eton-educated, embedded in the financial elite of New York City, and bound by friendship to Hamilton and to Secretary of War Henry Knox. Those connections were what mattered when, in 1791, the federal government needed to award the contract for supplying the Army that Major General Arthur St. Clair would lead into the Ohio country. The contract went to a partnership in which Duer held a substantial interest. The terms were straightforward. Duer's company would provide rations, transport, equipment, and animals to the Army at agreed prices. The federal government would pay. What the federal government did not know, and what St. Clair would not discover until his soldiers were starving in the wilderness, was that Duer had no intention of fulfilling the contract on time, in full, or to standard. The reason was greed, wearing the mask of leverage. Duer was simultaneously engaged in massive financial speculation involving Bank of New York stock and federal bonds, betting that the Bank of the United States would acquire the Bank of New York and convert it to a branch. His speculation required capital, and capital was easier to come by if you cut corners on a federal contract and pocketed the difference. Douar's contractors purchased the cheapest provisions they could source, hired the cheapest transport, used the cheapest livestock, and routed the savings into Douar's trading positions. The plan depended on the speculation succeeding so that the supplies could eventually be made whole from speculative profits. The speculation did not succeed. By the time the army needed its supplies in earnest, Douar was overextended, scrambling to maintain his trading positions and unable to deliver on his obligations. The consequences in the field were immediate and catastrophic. Reports from St. Clair's quartermaster, Samuel Hodgdon, document the failures with the bureaucratic precision of a man who recognized that someone was going to be blamed and was determined that it would not be him. The flour delivered to the army was old, in some cases more than 2 years old, infested with weevils and partially rotten. The beef was rancid before it was salted. The salt itself, necessary for preserving meat in the field, arrived in insufficient quantities. The axes provided for clearing roads through the wilderness were made of cheap iron that shattered on the first hard strike against an oak. The pack saddles for the horses were poorly stitched and broke under load. The horses themselves were the most damning evidence of the fraud. The army required several hundred pack horses to move supplies through the Ohio forests. Douar's contractors delivered animals so old and undernourished that veterans of the campaign reported the horses began dying within the first week of the march. By mid-October, the army was hauling its own supplies because so many of the horses had collapsed. The clothing situation was perhaps the most lethal of the logistics failures. The 1791 expedition included approximately 500 six-month levies, soldiers recruited specifically for the campaign on short-term enlistments. The contracts under which they had been recruited specified that they would be provided with uniforms, including winter clothing for a campaign that all parties understood would extend into late autumn. The winter clothing did not arrive. As the army moved north into the Ohio forests in October, with temperatures dropping into the low 30s at night and freezing rain becoming a near daily occurrence, the levies were marching in summer-weight linen and worn-out shoes. Pneumonia and dysentery began moving through the ranks. By the time the army reached the headwaters of the Wabash, hundreds of men were sick. Some were too sick to march and had to be carried. Others continued in formation, while running fevers that would kill them within a week, regardless of any combat that might occur. What St. Clair did not understand, and what almost no American official understood until the congressional investigation pieced it together months later, was that the trap had already closed. The trap was set before the army left Cincinnati. Every component of what would happen at the Wabash, the inability to maneuver, the inability to fortify, the inability to feed and shelter the troops, the inability to maintain morale, the inability to retain manpower against desertion, traced back to a New York counting house where a former Treasury official named William Duer was using federal contract money to chase stock prices. The American soldiers who would die in the Ohio meadow were already in the process of being killed by speculation in a city they would never see. They simply had not yet met the warriors who would deliver the verdict. Picture the man Washington chose to lead the campaign. Major General Arthur St. Clair, 57 years old, Scottish-born, educated at the University of Edinburgh, a veteran of the British Army before he switched sides in the Revolution, a former president of the Continental Congress, currently serving as governor of the Northwest Territory. On paper, he was the most distinguished American not named Washington to hold field command. He had served at Trenton, at Princeton, at Brandywine. He had surrendered Fort Ticonderoga in 1777, an action that resulted in a court-martial that ultimately exonerated him but that would shadow his reputation for the rest of his life. He had governed the Northwest Territory since 1788 with a combination of legal scholarship and political acumen that even his critics respected. What he did not have, and what the next 8 weeks would prove he could not compensate for, was a body capable of waging a wilderness campaign. St. Clair suffered from gout. This is not a euphemism, not a polite Victorian gloss on something else. Gout in 1791 was a specific, well-documented, inflammatory condition that produced excruciating pain in the joints, particularly in the feet and knees. In its severe forms, it rendered patients unable to walk, unable to mount horses, unable to bear the weight of standard military boots. By the autumn of 1791, St. Clair's gout was severe. Witnesses describe him being lifted onto his horse by aides, who would then strap him in to prevent him from falling. On bad days, when the inflammation was at its worst, he could not sit a saddle at all and was carried on a litter between 2 pack animals. His command tent had to be configured so that he could conduct meetings while reclining, his swollen legs elevated. Procopius, writing of Belisarius at Dara, described his subject's calm under pressure as the genuine calm of a man who had thought through every contingency. St. Clair's calm in 1791 was the calm of a man who knew he was physically incapable of executing the role he had been assigned and was determined to do it anyway. The decision to give him the command had been made by Washington personally and reluctantly. The president had wanted Anthony Wayne, a younger and more aggressive officer who would eventually inherit this same campaign 3 years later. Political considerations made Wayne unavailable. Washington had wanted Henry Knox, his Secretary of War, to take the field personally. Knox declined, citing the need to manage the broader military establishment from Philadelphia. The choice came down to St. Clair, whose seniority, political reliability, and Northwest Territory governorship made him the obvious institutional candidate. Washington's instructions to St. Clair, delivered personally in March 1791, contained a specific warning. The president, who had survived Braddock's defeat in 1755 and had spent his early military career in exactly the kind of forest warfare St. Clair was about to undertake, told his commander explicitly to beware of surprise, to fortify every camp, to never march without flanking parties. The instructions were detailed, specific, and almost prophetic in their accuracy about what would go wrong if they were ignored. St. Clair received them. St. Clair, when the moment came, did not follow them. The portrait that emerges from the surviving correspondence is of a man caught between his understanding of what needed to be done and his physical inability to do it. St. Clair knew his army needed better discipline. He could not personally enforce it because he could not be physically present at the relevant points along his column. He knew his supply situation was deteriorating. He could not personally inspect the depots because he could not walk through them. He knew his subordinate officers were quarreling among themselves. He could not personally mediate because the meetings exhausted him. By late October, when supply officers met him on the road, they found him so ill with the gout that he was being carried in a litter rather than mounted on a horse. The army that approached the Wabash in early November was being commanded by a man whose body had effectively been removed from the field he was responsible for, leaving him to govern what he could not directly see. Across the forest, the Confederacy was operating under a command structure that has confused American military historians for 2 centuries because it does not map onto European categories. There was no commander-in-chief in the modern sense. There was a council, The council met repeatedly through the spring, summer, and autumn of 1791, drawing in war chiefs and civil chiefs from across the member nations. Decisions were reached by consensus. Once reached, they were executed with a coordination that suggested, to American observers who could not see the council meetings, the existence of a unified command. The unified command was the council itself. What it produced was tactical sophistication of a kind the United States Army would not match in the Northwest Territory until Anthony Wayne rebuilt the Army from scratch. Little Turtle of the Miami was 44 years old in 1791. The English version of his name, Mishikinakwa, translates more accurately as snapping turtle, with the connotation of an animal that strikes faster than its size suggests possible. He had been born near Devil's Lake in modern-day Indiana. His military reputation had been established the previous autumn against Harmar, where his ambushes of detached American columns had inflicted casualties at a ratio approaching 10-1. He was, by every account that has survived, a reserved man, soft-spoken in council, decisive in execution. American officers who would meet him after the war described him as one of the most intelligent military minds they had ever encountered. A judgment that was not flattery, but professional recognition. Blue Jacket of the Shawnee was perhaps a year or two older, in his mid-40s, and represented a different temperament. Where Little Turtle was the strategist, the man who studied terrain and timing, Blue Jacket was the operational commander, the leader who excelled at the moment of execution. He had fought the Americans in Kentucky for 15 years. He understood the psychology of frontier warfare in a way that few of his contemporaries could match. He knew how to inflict the kind of casualties that broke an army's will rather than just its body. Bukangahelas of the Delaware completed the senior leadership. Older than the other two, possibly in his 60s by 1791, he commanded the moral authority of a man whose people had been pushed across an entire continent by colonial expansion. The Delaware had been displaced from New Jersey, then Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then again to the upper Wabash. Bukangahelas had personal memories of every stage of that displacement. His warriors fought with the particular intensity of men defending what they understood to be their last possible home. These three men, with the supporting council of warriors from the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Mingo nations, assembled and trained a force of approximately 1,000-1, 100 warriors in the late summer and early autumn of 1791. The force was disciplined in ways that surprised the British observers who occasionally interacted with it. Warriors drilled in coordinated movements. Tactical signals were rehearsed. The plan that would be executed at the Wabash was developed over weeks of council meetings, refined through scouting reports on St. Clair's column, and committed to memory by every participant before the engagement. Little Turtle's spies followed the Americans from the day they left Cincinnati. The Confederacy knew, with reasonable accuracy, the size of St. Clair's force, the rate of his desertions, the condition of his horses, and the contents of his supply train. The Americans knew almost nothing about the Confederacy by comparison. The asymmetry of intelligence was as decisive as the asymmetry of supply. The army that St. Clair was leading north was, by the standards of any professional military observer, an institution that should not have been sent into combat. At its theoretical peak strength on the muster rolls, the expedition numbered approximately 2,000 men. By the time it reached the headwaters of the Wabash, that number had collapsed to roughly 1,400 effective soldiers. And even that figure is generous, given the rates of illness in the ranks. The composition of the force was a snapshot of what the early American military was actually capable of generating, which is to say, not very much. At the core of the expedition were approximately 600 regulars from the 2nd Infantry Regiment. These were professional soldiers in the limited sense that 1791 understood the term. They had enlisted for 3-year terms. They had received some basic drill training at Fort Washington. They were paid, equipped, and housed at federal expense. Their officers were career soldiers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans. By American standards, they were the best the country could produce. By the standards of the British Army or the Prussian Army of the same period, they would have been considered raw recruits, with months of additional training still required before they could be considered fit for line service. Surrounding the regulars were approximately 500 6-month levies. These were the men recruited specifically for the campaign on short-term enlistments, paid a bounty to sign on for the single season. The recruitment standards had been almost non-existent. Surviving correspondence from the recruiting officers describes the levies in language that has become famous in the historical literature as men purchased from prisons, wheelbarrows, and brothels. The phrase is unkind, but not entirely inaccurate. The recruiters had been desperate to fill quotas. They had taken essentially anyone willing to sign. The result was a force composed disproportionately of urban poor from Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. Men who had never seen a forest, never fired a musket before enlistment, and in some cases did not speak English as a first language. They had been drilled for a few weeks at most. They were, in any meaningful military sense, civilians in uniform. Approximately 300 Kentucky militia rounded out the force. The militia were frontiersmen, men who knew the woods, who could shoot, who had personal experience of indigenous warfare. They were also, as a group, allergic to military discipline. They had volunteered for short tours, expected to return home when those tours expired regardless of operational circumstances, and resented every order that came from regulars or levies. Desertion among the militia was endemic. By the final days of October, militia detachments were leaving the column nightly. The cumulative effect of these desertions on the Army's effective strength would prove disastrous. Then there were the camp followers. The 1791 expedition was followed by approximately 200 to 250 women and children, the wives and dependents of soldiers and officers, along with laundresses and sutlers' assistants. The presence of camp followers in 18th century armies was standard practice. They performed essential support functions: cooking, washing, mending, nursing the sick. Their presence on the Wabash expedition, however, would become one of the most haunting elements of the disaster. These women and children, traveling with an army that was increasingly unable to feed itself, would find themselves at the center of the killing zone when the attack came. They would not survive in numbers that any humane military planning would have prevented. Of the approximately 200 women in the camp on the morning of November 4th, only 3 are recorded as having escaped alive. The men who had brought their families with them on the campaign had done so under the assumption that the Army would protect them. The Army would not be capable of protecting itself. The campaign that would end at the Wabash officially began on September 17, 1791, when the Army moved north from Ludlow Station, a forward staging post a few miles from Fort Washington. The first day's march covered approximately 5 miles. The second day's march covered approximately 4. The pace would not significantly improve. The reason was the road, which did not yet exist and which the Army was simultaneously building as it advanced. St. Clair had decided, against the advice of some of his officers, to construct a fortified supply line as he moved. This meant cutting a wagon road wide enough for artillery pieces and supply wagons, building bridges across every stream, and constructing a chain of forts at regular intervals to garrison the route. The strategy was not unreasonable on its face. A fortified supply line meant the army could be reinforced and resupplied during the campaign and could retreat in good order if the operation failed. The strategy assumed, however, that the army had the time, the manpower, and the supplies to build it. The army had none of these things in adequate quantity. The first major fort along the route was Fort Hamilton, constructed at the modern site of Hamilton, Ohio, on the Great Miami River. It took the army nearly 3 weeks to build, time during which the campaign clock continued to advance and the autumn weather continued to deteriorate. The fort itself was a respectable structure, palisaded with bastions at the corners, capable of garrisoning 100 soldiers. It was finished in early October. The army then continued north, building road as it went, for another 44 miles before pausing again to construct Fort Jefferson at the modern site of Greenville, Ohio. Fort Jefferson took another 2 weeks. It was completed on October 24th. By the time the army left Fort Jefferson on October 25th, more than 5 weeks had passed since the campaign had officially commenced, and the army had advanced approximately 70 miles from Fort Washington. The cumulative effect of these delays was catastrophic on multiple dimensions simultaneously. The first dimension was weather. The Ohio country in late October produces overnight frosts and freezing rain. By early November, snow flurries are common. The army, whose winter clothing had never arrived from Duer's contractors, was beginning to die from exposure. Soldiers without coats huddled around fires at night. Sentries lost fingers and toes to frostbite. The walking sick list grew longer every morning. The second dimension was supply. The food supply, already inadequate at the start of the campaign, was being consumed faster than it could be replenished from the rear. The pack horses that should have been hauling fresh provisions forward were dying. The road that should have been allowing wagons to follow the army was so muddy from autumn rains that wagons were getting stuck and abandoned. The third dimension was morale. Soldiers who had enlisted for 6-month tours were watching those tours expire and beginning to ask, with increasing volume, when they would be allowed to go home. Officers were quarreling. Discipline was eroding. The fourth dimension was desertion. The militia began deserting in significant numbers in mid-October. By late October, individual desertions had become group desertions, and groups of armed men were leaving the column at night, taking their weapons and equipment with them, and heading south back toward Kentucky. On October 31st, an event occurred that exemplified the situation. Approximately 60 militia announced their intention to desert as a group and threatened to seize the supply wagons coming up from the rear if anyone tried to stop them. St. Clair, faced with the prospect of his entire supply train being seized by mutineers, made a decision that would prove tactically devastating. He detached his 1st American Regiment, approximately 300 of his most disciplined regular troops, and sent them south to apprehend the deserters and protect the incoming supplies. The 1st American was the best unit in the Army. It contained the most experienced officers and the most thoroughly trained enlisted men. It was the unit St. Clair would most have wanted at his side in any combat engagement. He sent it away 3 days before the attack. The remaining force, approximately 1,400 effective soldiers plus the camp followers, continued north from Fort Jefferson on November 1st. The march on November 1st covered approximately 6 miles. November 2nd covered another 7. On November 3rd, the Army made approximately 8 miles before reaching what the surviving officers described as a high meadow on the bank of a substantial creek. St. Clair, examining his maps, concluded that the creek was the St. Mary's River, a tributary of the Maumee. He was wrong. The creek was the easternmost headwater of the Wabash River, an entirely different watershed. The geographic error was not St. Clair's fault in any meaningful sense. The maps available to American officers in 1791 were genuinely inadequate, and the headwater regions of multiple river systems converge in this part of Ohio in ways that confused European-trained surveyors for decades. But the consequence of the error was that St. Clair believed he was farther from the major indigenous population centers than he actually was. He believed the Army had time to rest and refit before continuing toward what he thought was his target. He was, in fact, within 15 miles of Kekionga and being shadowed by a force more than 2/3 the size of his own that was preparing to attack at dawn. The Army made camp on the evening of November 3rd in a configuration that would prove indefensible. The high meadow was perhaps 350 yards long and 70 yards wide at its widest point. It sloped gently toward the creek on its western edge. 2 rectangular formations of regulars and levies were drawn up in parallel lines along the long axis of the meadow, with the artillery in the center and the camp followers and supply wagons behind them. Across the creek, on the western bank, the Kentucky militia were positioned in a separate camp roughly 300 yards from the main army. The geography of this deployment was a textbook violation of every principle of forest warfare that Washington had specifically warned St. Clair about in March. The two halves of the Army could not support each other directly. The creek, while shallow, was an obstacle that would slow any movement between the two camps. The high ground on either side of the meadow, including a wooded ridge that extended along the eastern flank, was uncleared and unscouted. The forest came to within 50 yards of the soldiers' tents on 3 sides. And most damningly of all, no breastworks had been constructed, no fallen logs piled into defensive positions, no trenches dug, even shallow ones, no abatis arranged. The Army was sleeping in an open meadow, surrounded by forest, with an enemy force of unknown size somewhere in the immediate vicinity. That the enemy was somewhere in the immediate vicinity was not a matter of speculation. It was a matter of intelligence that had reached St. Clair's camp through multiple channels and had been ignored or mishandled in each case. The first warning came from indigenous scouts attached to the Army. The Chickasaw, traditional rivals of the northern tribes, had agreed to provide reconnaissance for the expedition, but had become increasingly alarmed in the days leading up to November 3rd, and had begun reporting concentrations of enemy warriors within striking distance of the column. Their reports were noted and not acted upon. The second warning came from the Army's own pickets, who had reported sighting unidentified figures in the woods on multiple occasions during the final days of the march. These reports were dismissed as the routine paranoia of nervous sentries. The third warning, and the most explicit, came on the night of November 3rd itself. Captain Jacob Slough, an officer of the levies, took a small reconnaissance party out from the camp shortly after dark on Colonel Oldham's orders, who had told Slough he expected the Army would be attacked in the morning. What Slough's party encountered, he would describe in detail in testimony to the congressional investigation the following year. About a mile beyond the militia camp, they observed multiple parties of warriors moving in the darkness. There were exchanges of fire. Slough's party fell back. Slough went immediately to report what he had seen to his superior officer, Major General Richard Butler, the second in command of the entire expedition. Butler listened to Slough's report. He thanked Slough for his vigilance and told him to lie down and rest. He did not pass the report to St. Clair. He did not order additional pickets. He did not wake the army. St. Clair would not learn of Slough's scouting episode for 5 days, by which time most of the men involved were dead. Why Butler made this decision, the most consequential single error of judgment in the entire campaign, has been debated by historians for 2 centuries. The most plausible explanation involves the well-documented friction between Butler and St. Clair, 2 senior officers who had been at odds throughout the campaign and who, according to surviving correspondence, were barely speaking by the final days of the march. The standard 19th century authority on the battle, Albach, wrote that the circumstances of Butler's silence would favor the inference that he sacrificed the safety of the army to the gratification of his animosity against St. Clair. Whatever the explanation, the warning that could have saved the army from its surprise attack was received, processed, and discarded by the wrong man at the wrong moment. Around 3 in the morning on November 4th, the warriors of the Northwestern Confederacy began moving into their final assault positions. The deployment had been planned over weeks of council meetings and rehearsed by the warriors who would execute it. Approximately 1,000 to 1,100 warriors, divided into multiple detachments under the command of Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, Buckangahelas, and lesser war chiefs, assumed positions in a continuous arc that extended from a point north of the meadow, around the eastern flank, behind the army's southern rear, and around the western flank to a point opposite the militia camp. The arc was the half moon, the crescent, the formation that has become the namesake of the engagement in the surviving Confederacy oral traditions. By the time the arc was complete, the American army was surrounded on every side by an enemy force that, although smaller in absolute numbers, had achieved the tactical superiority of being able to choose the moment and direction of every engagement that would follow. The attack began at approximately 6 in the morning, at the moment of réveillé, when the American soldiers were beginning to assemble for the morning roll call. The first volleys came from the direction of the militia camp on the western side of the creek. The Confederacy's plan called for the initial assault to fall on the militia, the weakest unit in the army, with the deliberate objective of breaking it and driving the survivors back across the creek into the main camp, where their panic would disrupt the formation of the regulars and levies before those units could organize a coherent defense. The plan worked exactly as it had been designed. The militia, half-dressed, many of them still rolling out of their blankets, were hit by a volley from concealed positions in the surrounding forest that killed and wounded perhaps 50 men in the first 30 seconds. The survivors did what unfortified troops always do when surprised in their camp. They ran. They ran toward the only refuge they could see, which was the main camp across the creek. They ran across the creek, which was knee-deep and freezing. And they ran into the formations of regulars and levies who were just then attempting to assemble in their lines. The collision of fleeing militiamen with forming regulars created exactly the chaos the Confederacy had planned for. Officers were unable to make themselves heard over the screams of the wounded and the shouted reports of the survivors. Soldiers in the rear ranks, hearing the firing and seeing the militia fleeing toward them, began to fire blindly into the woods at targets they could not see. Soldiers in the front ranks, struck by friendly fire from behind, began to fall before they had even seen an enemy warrior. This was the situation, less than 10 minutes into the engagement, when the horns of the Confederacy crescent began to close. Within 15 minutes of the first volley, The encirclement was complete. The two ends of the Confederacy crescent had swept around the eastern and western flanks of the meadow, met at a point south of the Army's position, and closed the perimeter. Every direction of escape was now under fire. The American soldiers, attempting to form into the linear ranks that European military doctrine required for effective volley fire, found themselves shooting at trees, at smoke, at muzzle flashes that disappeared before they could be aimed at. The warriors of the Confederacy were doing exactly what indigenous warfare in the eastern woodlands had always done. They were fighting from cover. From behind logs and fallen trees and the trunks of standing oaks, they were firing aimed shots at specific targets, then moving to new positions before the American soldiers could return fire effectively. They were exploiting every fold in the terrain, every patch of brush, every shadow. They were, in the descriptions left by American survivors, phantom-like, impossible to see, impossible to engage, impossible to drive away. The American response was the only response their training had prepared them to deliver. They formed ranks. They fired volleys. The volleys went into the woods at the level of a standing man's chest, which was approximately 3 feet above the heads of warriors who were shooting from prone positions or from behind cover. Major Ebenezer Denny, an aide to St. Clair who survived the engagement and whose journal would become one of the most important primary sources for what happened, recorded the scene with the precision of a man who recognized he was watching something unprecedented. The American volleys, he wrote, accomplished nothing. The Confederacy fire, by contrast, was producing American casualties at a rate that suggested every shot was finding a target. The geometric mathematics of the situation was simple and terrible. The Americans were standing in formation. The warriors were behind cover. Every American soldier was visible. Almost no warrior was. The casualty exchange ratio was being calculated with each passing minute in favor of the side that could see its targets. St. Clair's 8 artillery pieces, 4 3-pounder field guns, and 4 heavier pieces were positioned in the center of the camp. They represented, on paper, the Army's decisive firepower advantage. They proved, in execution, almost completely useless. The Confederacy had identified the artillery as a priority target during their planning. Specific groups of warriors had been assigned to suppress the gun crews. Those warriors took up positions within musket range of the guns and began systematically shooting the crewmen as they attempted to load and fire. The first crew to take casualties was the crew of the leftmost gun, where the gunner was killed by a single shot to the head while he was sponging the bore between rounds. His matros, the assistant who handled the powder, was killed seconds later. The replacements who came forward to man the gun were killed in a turn. By the time the 3rd or 4th crew of replacements had fallen, the surviving soldiers were unwilling to approach the gun at all. The pattern repeated at the other artillery positions. Within an hour, every gun crew had been substantially destroyed. The pieces themselves had been fired only a handful of times, and most of those shots had been fired in panic, at high elevations, with the rounds passing harmlessly over the heads of the warriors and into the empty forest beyond. When American troops returned to the battlefield in late 1793, they would find some of the cannons still in place. Their muzzles pointed skyward at angles suggesting that the last men to fire them had not understood what they were aiming at. The American officer corps was being destroyed at a rate that paralleled the destruction of the artillery. The warriors of the Confederacy had identified officers as priority targets through the visual indicators of their rank. The better cut of their coats, the shoulder epaulettes, the swords drawn for command, American officers in the 18th century positioned themselves visibly to lead their units, an essential requirement of European linear tactics that had never developed effective methods of dispersal. In the forest at the Wabash, this visibility was lethal. Of approximately 52 officers present in the engagement, 39 would be killed and 7 of the remainder wounded. The casualty rate among the officer corps would approach 90% before the engagement was over. Among the dead would be Major General Richard Butler, the second in command, the man who had received and ignored Captain Slough's intelligence the previous night. Butler was wounded twice in the early stages of the battle, refused evacuation, continued to give orders from a sitting position propped against a fallen tree, and was killed by a third shot approximately 90 minutes into the engagement. His final words, according to officers who were near him, expressed regret at his quarrels with St. Clair. The reconciliation came too late by several hours and several thousand lives. St. Clair himself, despite the gout that had crippled him for weeks, demonstrated in the engagement a personal courage that even his political enemies would later concede had been extraordinary. Unable to walk effectively, he was lifted onto horse after horse and rode through the firing line, attempting to rally his troops. 3 horses were shot from under him during the course of the morning, and according to some accounts, a 4th was killed beneath him as well. 6 or more musket balls passed through his clothing, one of them carrying away a lock of his hair. He was not seriously wounded. The protective providence that some American officers attributed to his survival was, more prosaically, a function of the angles from which the warriors were firing and the chaos that prevented sustained, aimed fire at any single target for very long. St. Clair was visible. He was identifiable as a senior officer. The reason he survived when other senior officers did not was probably random. The reason he kept moving, kept giving orders, kept attempting to organize a coherent defense from a body that was failing him in every other dimension was character. By every account that survived the engagement, in his moment of catastrophe, St. Clair was the man Washington had hoped he would be. The disaster was happening regardless. The situation within the perimeter, as the second hour of combat began, was deteriorating in ways that the survivors would describe for the rest of their lives in language that suggested they had witnessed something close to hell. The dead and wounded were piling up in the open ground at the center of the camp. The wounded who could still move were crawling toward whatever shelter they could find. Behind wagons, beneath supply boxes, in the lee of dead horses. The camp followers, the women and children whose presence had been intended as a domestic comfort to the soldiers, found themselves at the geographic center of the killing zone. Some of them began doing what soldiers were expected to do. They picked up muskets from the dead and began firing into the woods. They reloaded weapons for soldiers who were still firing. They dragged wounded men toward what cover existed. The stories that would emerge from this phase of the battle, sifted through the necessary skepticism of orally transmitted accounts and the romanticism of 19th century histories, contain enough corroborated detail to establish that the women in the camp fought with a competence and ferocity that surprised the men around them. The most famous of these stories involved a woman the surviving accounts call Red-Haired Nance of the Wabash. Her actual name has been lost. She was, by the consistent description of multiple survivors, the wife of a militiaman, perhaps in her late 20s, with red hair conspicuous enough that warriors from multiple parts of the perimeter would later remember her. According to the surviving accounts, when the warriors broke through the militia camp on the western side of the creek and pursued the fleeing soldiers across to the main encampment, Nance was caught in the open with her infant child. She fought with what was at hand, which according to the stories included a heavy iron frying pan she had been preparing breakfast in, and she successfully drove off the first warriors who reached her. The respite was temporary. As the encirclement closed and the fighting in the camp became continuous, Nance reached a calculation that no parent should ever have to reach. She could not protect both herself and the infant. She placed the child on the ground, in what shelter the scattered baggage afforded, and she continued fighting. She was one of the 3 women who survived the battle. She did not find her child. She would spend the rest of her life, according to local Ohio traditions that persisted into the 20th century, returning to the battlefield in the warmer months and searching the surrounding forest for the bones of an infant who had been taken or who had died of exposure on the morning of November 4th. Whether she ever found anything is not recorded. The persistence of the search is. Other stories from the camp follower contingent describe women using burning brands from cooking fires to drive cowardly soldiers out of hiding places beneath the wagons and back into the firing line. The image is harsh, but the function was tactical. An army that loses cohesion in combat dies faster than an army that maintains it, regardless of how badly outmatched it is. The women in St. Clair's camp, for as long as they were alive, performed something close to the function of provost troops, enforcing a level of discipline that the regular officer corps was no longer capable of enforcing, because most of those officers were dead. By the time the order to break out came, perhaps 200 of the women in the camp had been killed. Some had died fighting. Some had died trying to shelter their children. Some had died trying to reach wounded husbands. The numbers are imprecise because no one was counting, and because the bodies of women and children at the center of the camp were among the most thoroughly destroyed in the post-battle violence. 3 women survived. The other 200 or so did not. By approximately 8 in the morning, 2 hours into the engagement, St. Clair recognized that the position was untenable. Continued resistance from the meadow would result in the systematic destruction of the entire force. The only remaining option was to break out of the encirclement and attempt to escape south along the road the army had cut on its way north. The decision required a calculation that combined acknowledgement of defeat with the cold arithmetic of which casualties were now unavoidable. Every man who remained in the meadow would die. Some unknown percentage of those who attempted the breakout would die in the attempt. Some smaller percentage would escape. The optimization, in St. Clair's mind, was to maximize the percentage who escaped, which meant committing the breakout while there were still enough soldiers left to make it possible. The orders went out shortly after 8. Colonel William Dark, commanding what remained of the levies on the right flank, was instructed to lead a bayonet charge directly into the southern face of the encirclement. The objective was to punch a hole in the Confederacy line, hold the hole open long enough for the rest of the army to pour through, and then collapse onto the road and run. The charge was executed with the desperate energy of men who knew it was their last chance to live. Dark's men fixed bayonets, formed up in a column 3 or 4 ranks deep, and ran directly at the warriors holding the southern arc of the crescent. The warriors, faced with a charge of fixed bayonets at close range, did what light infantry has always done in similar situations. They gave way temporarily, melting back into the forest to avoid the cold steel, planning to close back in once the charge had passed. The temporary breach was the opening the army needed. The remnants of the regulars, the levies, the surviving militia, and the surviving camp followers poured through the gap and onto the southern road. What followed was no longer a battle. It was a flight, a panic-stricken flight, in the words of Major Denny's journal, of men so terrified that they threw away anything that might slow them down. Muskets, hats, coats, knapsacks, ammunition pouches. The road for the first 4 miles south of the meadow was, according to the descriptions of officers who later traversed it, almost continuously covered with discarded equipment. Soldiers ran with bare arms in the freezing air. Some ran without shoes. The sick and the wounded who could not keep up were left behind. Some called out to their comrades to be carried. Most of those calls were ignored. The instinct of self-preservation, which the Army's discipline had been intended to suppress, broke through every constraint and turned a defeat into a rout. The Confederacy warriors pursued for several miles. The pursuit was not unlimited. After perhaps 4 or 5 miles of running fight, in which fleeing Americans were shot down at long range and stragglers were systematically killed, most of the warriors broke off the pursuit and returned to the meadow. The reason was not mercy. The reason was that the meadow contained the spoils of the campaign, the abandoned artillery, the supply wagons that had not been destroyed, the muskets and ammunition of the dead, the personal possessions of an army that had outfitted itself for a season in the field, for a confederacy whose warriors had been fighting at the limits of their own logistics. The meadow at the headwaters of the Wabash was a strategic resource that could not be abandoned for the marginal additional casualties of an extended pursuit. The warriors went back to claim the spoils. The American survivors, without active pursuit, made it to the road, made it past the first checkpoints of the route they had cut on their way north, and made it eventually back toward Fort Jefferson. The flight to Fort Jefferson covered 29 miles. The Army that had taken 6 days to march that distance northward retraced it in approximately 18 hours. The soldiers who arrived at the fort in the late afternoon and early evening of November 4th were, in the descriptions of the garrison who watched them straggle in, almost unrecognizable as a military force. Many were without weapons. Many were without coats. Many were bleeding from wounds they had received hours earlier and had not paused to bind. Some were carrying wounded comrades. Most were not. The sick who had been carried by their friends in the early stages of the flight had been progressively abandoned as exhaustion overcame loyalty. By the time the survivors reached Fort Jefferson, the road behind them was littered with discarded equipment, abandoned wounded, and the bodies of men who had simply collapsed and died from exposure or hemorrhage during the long retreat. Fort Jefferson itself was not large enough to shelter the remnants of the army that converged on it. The garrison consisted of perhaps 100 soldiers and a few weeks' supply of food. The arrival of approximately 700 to 800 survivors, many of them wounded, none of them carrying any rations, transformed the fort overnight into a scene of compounding disaster. The food situation collapsed within hours. The wounded began dying for lack of medical care, since the Army's surgeons and most of their supplies had been lost on the battlefield. The shelter was inadequate against the freezing November nights. St. Clair, who had survived the battle and the retreat, made a second decision under fire that has been criticized, but that probably represented the only available option. He ordered the able-bodied survivors to continue south, another 45 miles to Fort Hamilton, where the supply situation was somewhat better and where the wounded could potentially be evacuated to Fort Washington for actual medical treatment. The wounded who could not move were left at Fort Jefferson under the care of a small detachment, with provisions that all parties understood were inadequate for the duration of the wait that would be required before relief could arrive. Some of those wounded would die at Fort Jefferson over the following weeks. Others would survive long enough to be evacuated. The choice St. Clair had made was the choice between losing some wounded by abandonment and losing all of them by remaining in a position that could not feed itself. The march from Fort Jefferson to Fort Hamilton took 3 more days. The survivors who reached Fort Hamilton on November 7th and 8th were in marginally better condition than those who had reached Fort Jefferson on November 4th, in the sense that they had eaten something and had been able to bind their wounds. They were not, in any meaningful sense, an army anymore. The structure of regiments and companies had dissolved. Officers had been killed in such numbers that surviving units were being commanded by sergeants and corporals. Equipment had been abandoned at multiple points along the road. Discipline was non-existent. Morale was below any level that 19th century military terminology had categories for. The institution that had marched out of Fort Washington 7 weeks earlier had ceased to exist as a fighting organization. What returned to Fort Washington in the second week of November was a column of survivors, walking south because they had been walking south for days and had nowhere else to go. The accounting of what had been lost would take weeks to complete and would never be fully exact, because some of the dead were never recovered, and because the records that should have provided definitive numbers had themselves been destroyed in the camp. The figures that emerged from the post-battle reports represented the best estimates that could be made from muster rolls compared against survivor counts. They were sufficient to establish, with confidence, that the United States had just suffered the worst military defeat in its short history. Between 630 and 657 American soldiers had been killed in action or had died of wounds. Another 271 to 280 had been wounded and survived. The combined casualties among the soldiers exceeded 900 men. Add the camp followers, of whom approximately 200 had been killed, and the total casualty count exceeded 1,100. The proportion of the engaged force that had been killed or wounded ranged, depending on how the totals were calculated, from approximately 75% to approximately 97% in some specific units. The officer corps had been particularly devastated. 39 of the Army's 52 engaged officers had been killed, including Major General Richard Butler, 2 colonels, 3 majors, and the majority of the captains and lieutenants. The decimation of the officer corps was, in some ways, the most strategically significant element of the loss, because experienced officers could not be quickly replaced, and because the Army's institutional memory had been concentrated in the men who were now dead. The Confederacy's losses, by every account that has survived from any side, were strikingly low. The most commonly cited figures place the Confederacy dead at approximately 21 and the wounded at approximately 40. The total of approximately 61 casualties against an American total exceeding 1,100 represents a casualty exchange ratio of roughly 15 to 1 in favor of the Confederacy. To find a comparable result in modern military history, one has to look to industrial age engagements in which one side possessed a decisive technological advantage over the other. The Confederacy possessed no technological advantage. They were, if anything, technologically inferior, fighting with a mix of trade muskets and older smoothbore weapons against an American force equipped with comparable or better firearms and supported by artillery. The casualty ratio was a function entirely of tactics, terrain, surprise, and command. It was the most thoroughgoing demonstration of asymmetric warfare's potential that the 18th century would produce. When American forces returned to the battlefield in December 1793, under a detachment of General Anthony Wayne's Legion, they found a scene that had been waiting for them through 2 Ohio winters. The bones of approximately 600 Americans were still scattered across the ground, gnawed by animals, weathered by frost. The wagons were still there. Several of the artillery pieces, partially intact, were still in their positions. Personal possessions of the dead, what had not been taken by the warriors as spoils, were scattered across the meadow and the surrounding road. Wayne's men spent days collecting bones for burial in mass graves. They built a fortification on the site, which they named Fort Recovery, both as a logistical measure and as a memorial. The soil-in-mouth detail had been reported by survivors of the original engagement and by traders and travelers who had visited the site during the intervening period. The detail had not been a single warrior's gesture in the moment of victory. It had been a deliberate, systematic act, performed across a substantial fraction of the bodies by warriors who had wanted to leave a message that the Americans returning would understand. The Americans had wanted land. The dirt in the dead men's mouths was the answer to the question of how much land they were entitled to. The trap was set before the army left Cincinnati. The verdict was delivered in the meadow. The message was delivered in the dirt. The political consequences of the disaster reached Philadelphia in the second week of December 1791, when official reports from Fort Washington made their way to the War Department. The initial reaction in the capital was disbelief. The numbers in St. Clair's report seemed impossible. Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, refused to share the worst of the casualty figures with President Washington for several days, partly out of bureaucratic self-protection and partly because he doubted the report's accuracy. When Washington finally received the full account, his reaction, according to his secretary Tobias Lear, was the most violent display of emotion the secretary had ever seen the president produce. Washington reportedly walked the floor of his study cursing St. Clair, cursing the army, cursing the conditions that had produced the catastrophe. The fury was unusual enough that Lear made specific mention of it in his correspondence. Washington's anger then settled, within a day or two, into the cold institutional response that would shape the next several years of American military and political development. The first political consequence was that Congress, returning from recess in January 1792, demanded an investigation. The House of Representatives passed a resolution calling for a select committee to investigate the causes of the defeat. The committee, chaired by Representative Thomas Fitzsimmons of Pennsylvania, requested from the executive branch all documents related to the campaign. The orders to St. Clair, the contracts with William Dewar's Supply Company, the correspondence between the War Department and the field commander, the muster rolls and supply requisitions. The request was unprecedented. No congressional committee had ever before demanded executive branch documents related to operational decisions. Washington was now confronted with a constitutional question that the Constitution itself did not directly address. Did Congress have the right to demand all executive branch documents? Did the executive have the right to refuse? Washington convened his cabinet on April 2, 1792, to consider the question. The discussion that followed, recorded by Thomas Jefferson in his cabinet notes, has become foundational to American constitutional law. Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and Edmund Randolph debated the principles for hours. The conclusion they reached, drafted primarily by Jefferson, established the doctrine that has been called executive privilege. The executive branch, the cabinet concluded, had the right to withhold documents from Congress when their disclosure would harm the public interest. The executive should, in general, cooperate with congressional oversight. But the executive retained the authority to make final determinations about which documents would be released and which would not. The doctrine was a compromise between two extreme positions: complete executive secrecy on one hand, complete congressional access on the other. It established that there was a category of executive deliberation that the legislature could not automatically penetrate. In the specific case of the Wabash investigation, Washington released most of the requested documents. He withheld a small number that the cabinet judged sensitive. The Fitzsimmons Committee, satisfied with what it received, did not press the point. But the precedent had been set. Every subsequent dispute between Congress and the executive over document access, from the Watergate tapes to 21st century subpoenas, would invoke the principles articulated in the cabinet's response to the Wabash investigation. The Fitzsimmons Committee published its report in May 1792. The report ran to several dozen pages and was, by the standards of 18th century congressional investigation, remarkably thorough. It documented the logistical failures in detail. It traced the Duer contract scandal. It identified the timing of the campaign as a critical error, noting that the Army should never have begun its march so late in the season. It addressed the recruitment problems, observing that the 6-month levies had been recruited without adequate standards and trained without adequate time. It examined the equipment failures, the spoiled provisions, the substandard horses, the broken axes. It interviewed Captain Slough about his intelligence report and Major Butler's failure to act on it. It examined the friction between St. Clair and Butler. It questioned St. Clair himself, who appeared before the committee in person and answered questions for several days. The conclusions of the report were perhaps the most important institutional consequence of the entire affair. The committee, after months of investigation, did not place primary blame on St. Clair. The committee placed primary blame on the War Department, on the contractors who had failed to deliver supplies, on the Treasury Department personnel who had allowed the contracts to be exploited for private speculation, and on the systemic failure of the federal government to provide its army with the resources required to fight a war. St. Clair's personal conduct was characterized as creditable. His decisions in the field were characterized as defensible, given the resources he had been given. The disaster was diagnosed as institutional rather than personal. The diagnosis was politically convenient for St. Clair, but it was also, by the standards of the evidence available, accurate. The army that lost at the Wabash had been compromised by failures that had nothing to do with its commander's decisions on the morning of November 4th and everything to do with decisions made in Philadelphia offices in the months leading up to the campaign. St. Clair was forced to resign his commission in 1792, despite the committee's exoneration. The political optics of allowing the commander of the worst military defeat in American history to retain his rank were unsustainable. He returned to his position as governor of the Northwest Territory, which he held until 1802, when his political opposition to Ohio statehood led to his removal by President Jefferson. He spent the last years of his life in poverty in western Pennsylvania, the survivor of a campaign that had killed almost everyone around him. He died in 1818, 81 years old, having outlived almost every officer who had served under him at the Wabash by more than 2 decades. His final memoir, dictated to his daughter, was an extended defense of his conduct during the campaign. It was self-serving, but, in the major particulars, accurate. He had been given an impossible situation, and he had failed to surmount it. So, the document essentially conceded would almost any other commander have failed. William Duer, the man whose corruption had set the entire disaster in motion, faced his own reckoning before the Fitzsimmons Committee even completed its report. In March 1792, 3 months after the Wabash and 2 months before the committee's findings were published, Duer's financial speculation collapsed. The collapse triggered the Panic of 1792, the first major financial crisis in American history. Banks failed. Investors were ruined. The Bank of the United States nearly collapsed. Dewar himself was arrested for debt and confined to a New York City prison, where he would remain, with brief intervals, until his death in 1799. He never returned to public office. He never made restitution for the contracts he had failed to fulfill. The men who had died on the Wabash because his speculation had diverted their supply funds remained dead. The institutional failures the Fitzsimmons Committee documented were partially corrected through reforms in the contracting system. But the broader lesson, that mixing private speculation with public office produces disaster on multiple dimensions simultaneously, would have to be relearned periodically by every subsequent generation of American government. The strategic response of the Washington administration to the catastrophe was the recognition that the militia and short-term levy model could not produce an army capable of winning the Northwest. The institution that had been destroyed at the Wabash was not the institution that the United States needed. It needed something different, something professional, something organized along the lines that European armies had been refining for 2 centuries, and that the United States had largely been refusing to adopt out of ideological commitment to citizen soldiers and budgetary commitment to a small federal establishment. The decision was made in early 1792 to create a new force. Congress authorized it. Washington named it. They called it the Legion of the United States. Command of the Legion went to Anthony Wayne, the man Washington had wanted in 1791, and who was now, in the wake of the disaster, politically available. Wayne was 46 years old in 1792. A Pennsylvania native, a Revolutionary War veteran whose nickname Mad Anthony came from the aggressive personal courage he had demonstrated in actions like the storming of Stony Point in 1779. He was also, despite the nickname, a meticulous planner who had absorbed every lesson the European military theorists had to offer about the integration of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The mission Washington gave him was specific. He was to take the time required, however much time it took, to build an army capable of defeating the Northwestern Confederacy in open battle. He was not to march until he was ready. He was not to engage until the conditions were favorable. The catastrophe at the Wabash had purchased him the political space to do what St. Clair had not been allowed to do: spend 2 full years preparing his force before committing it to combat. Wayne spent those 2 years, from the summer of 1792 to the summer of 1794, transforming what had been an institutional disaster into a professional fighting force. He established a training camp at Legionville on the Ohio River near Pittsburgh, away from the corrupting influences of the eastern cities. He drilled his soldiers in formations specifically designed for forest warfare, including dispersed skirmish lines, interlocking fields of fire, and rapid transitions between line and column. He developed a corps of professional scouts who could operate independently in the wilderness and provide intelligence comparable to what Little Turtle's spies had been providing the Confederacy. He purchased horses, weapons, and provisions through more reliable contracting arrangements that did not depend on the integrity of speculators in the Treasury Department. Most consequentially, he established a single rule that he enforced without exception throughout his command. The Army would fortify its camp every night, regardless of how brief the halt or how distant the apparent threat. The mistake St. Clair had made would not be made under Wayne's command. Every meadow the Legion stopped in became, by sundown, a fortification. The Confederacy had its own internal debates during these 2 years. Little Turtle had read the strategic situation correctly almost from the start. He understood that the United States, having absorbed the lesson of the Wabash, would not send a second poorly prepared army. The next force the Americans sent would be different. It would be larger, better trained, better led. The Confederacy's victory at the Wabash had been a function of specific tactical conditions: surprise, terrain, asymmetric intelligence, the chronic logistical disaster of the American column. Those conditions were unlikely to repeat. Little Turtle, in council meetings during 1792 and 1793, argued that the Confederacy should consider negotiation, should seek to consolidate its gains while it still held them, should not stake everything on a second decisive battle that the Americans, having learned, might win. He was overruled. The militants in the Confederacy Council, supported by the British traders at Detroit, who continued to promise material assistance, argued that the Wabash victory was not an aberration, but a demonstration of permanent superiority. The American military, they argued, had been shown to be incapable of winning in the Ohio forests. The next American expedition would meet the same fate as St. Clair's. The Confederacy, they argued, should not negotiate from a position of victory. It should fight. The political dynamics of the council made the militant position dominant. Blue Jacket, by 1793, had emerged as the operational commander of the Confederacy's combined forces. Little Turtle, while still respected, had been gradually marginalized on questions of strategic direction. He continued to serve, continued to lead his Miami warriors, but the broader policy of the Confederacy was no longer his to set. Wayne's army moved north from Fort Washington in October 1793, advanced cautiously, fortified Fort Greenville as its forward base, and spent the winter conducting operations and reconnaissance in the country between the Wabash and the Maumee. The Legion was, in every measurable dimension, a different institution from the army that had been destroyed at the Wabash. Discipline was strict. Desertion rates were a fraction of what St. Clair had experienced. Supplies arrived on schedule. Scouts reported accurately. Camps were fortified. By the summer of 1794, Wayne was prepared to move toward the Confederacy's heartland at the Maumee Rapids, where British traders had encouraged the construction of a fortified indigenous defensive position called Fort Miamis. The decisive engagement, which Americans would call the Battle of Fallen Timbers, occurred on August 20th, 1794, at a site on the Maumee River where a tornado had recently flattened a stretch of forest, leaving the trees jumbled in heaps that the Confederacy chose as a defensive position. The choice of terrain was tactically reasonable. The fallen timbers provided cover from which warriors could fire on advancing Americans without exposing themselves. The terrain that had served the Confederacy so well in the open meadow at the Wabash, however, did not serve them at Fallen Timbers. Wayne's Legion advanced in dispersed skirmish formation with cavalry on the flanks. When the Confederacy fire opened from the cover of the fallen trees, Wayne ordered an immediate bayonet charge, supported by cavalry attacks on both flanks. The Confederacy line, designed to fight an extended firefight, was overrun in less than an hour. Warriors who tried to retreat from the fallen timbers found themselves caught in the open by Wayne's cavalry. The casualties on the Confederacy side, while never precisely counted, were severe. The American casualties were modest by comparison. The mathematical inversion of the Wabash had been completed. In an engagement against the same broad coalition of nations that had destroyed St. Clair's army, on terrain that the Confederacy had chosen, Wayne's professional force had won decisively. The aftermath compounded the Confederacy's defeat. The retreating warriors fell back to Fort Miamis. The British post they had been promised would shelter them. The British garrison commander, in a moment that would shape indigenous British relations for generations, refused to open the gates. The promise of British support, on which the militant faction in the Confederacy Council had staked its entire strategic position, evaporated in the moment of crisis. The warriors who had been told for years that the British would back them against the Americans discovered, when the moment came, that they would not. The Confederacy, militarily defeated and politically betrayed, broke apart over the autumn of 1794. The Treaty of Greenville, signed in August 1795 between Wayne and a coalition of tribal representatives, ceded most of modern Ohio and substantial portions of Indiana to the United States. The indigenous boundary that the Confederacy had defined as the Ohio River was permanently erased. The lands that had been the heart of the Northwestern Confederacy were now American. Little Turtle, who had argued against the strategic gamble that produced fallen timbers, signed the Treaty of Greenville and spent the rest of his life as a respected elder statesman, traveling to Philadelphia and Washington, meeting Presidents Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, and serving as an interlocutor between the indigenous nations and the American government. He died in 1812, by all accounts at peace with his choices. Blue Jacket also signed the treaty and lived until 1810. Bukongahelas died in 1804. The generation of military leaders who had defeated St. Clair at the Wabash was, within 15 years of their greatest victory, gone. The institutional military force they had built was gone with them. The lands they had defended were gone. The trap they had so brilliantly executed at the Wabash had bought their nations exactly 3 years of strategic respite. After that, the mathematics of demography, technology, and federal will had reasserted itself. There is a difficult truth at the center of any honest accounting of what happened on the Wabash, which is that the Confederacy's tactical genius, however perfectly executed, did not save the indigenous nations from displacement. It bought time. It cost the United States approximately 1,000 soldiers and substantial political capital. It forced the creation of the professional military that would, 3 years later, defeat the same coalition decisively. It demonstrated, beyond reasonable argument, that the indigenous nations of the eastern woodlands were capable of defeating European-style armies in their own terrain. None of this changed the underlying strategic calculus. The United States had more men, more resources, more political will, and more time than the Confederacy had. The Confederacy needed to win permanently to preserve its territory. The United States only needed to win once to take it. The asymmetry of the strategic situation overrode every tactical victory the Confederacy could produce. The Wabash was the highest tactical achievement indigenous warfare in North America would ever reach against the United States. It was not, and could not be, a strategic solution. The lessons that the United States Army drew from the Wabash, and that it codified through the institutional reforms of Wayne's Legion and the doctrinal shifts of the early 19th century, would shape American military development for more than a century afterward. The first lesson was that supply and logistics are not separable from combat capability. An army cannot fight effectively if it is starving, cold, sick, and equipped with broken tools. The professionalization of the military supply system, the establishment of inspection regimes for contractors, the development of dedicated quartermaster corps, all flowed from the recognition that William Dewar's speculation had killed soldiers as effectively as Confederacy musket fire. The second lesson was that training cannot be compressed. Soldiers who have been recruited from prisons and brothels and rushed through 3 weeks of drill cannot be expected to perform competently in combat. The 2-year training cycle Wayne instituted for the Legion became the template for serious American military preparation. repeated in the buildups before the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and every subsequent major conflict. The third lesson was that intelligence and reconnaissance are decisive. Armies that do not know where their enemies are will be surprised by them. The development of professional scouting capabilities, including the eventual creation of the Army's intelligence and reconnaissance branches, traces directly to the recognition that Captain Slough's report had been the single most valuable piece of information St. Clair's Army possessed, and that its mishandling had killed nearly 1,000 men. The fourth lesson, which the United States Army would relearn periodically through the 19th and 20th centuries, was that European linear tactics do not work against opponents who fight from cover. The development of dispersed formations, the use of skirmishers, the integration of cover and concealment into doctrine, all responded to the demonstration that warriors firing from behind logs could destroy soldiers standing in ranks regardless of how disciplined the soldiers were or how superior their weapons. The lesson was learned at the Wabash, partially forgotten by the time of the Civil War, painfully relearned in the Indian Wars of the West, partially forgotten again by 1914, and relearned once more in the trenches of France. Every subsequent generation of American soldiers has had to discover, through their own casualties, what St. Clair's regulars discovered in the Ohio forest: visibility kills, cover saves. The fifth lesson concerned the relationship between civilian oversight and military operations. The Fitzsimmons investigation, the establishment of executive privilege, the reforms in contracting that followed the Duer scandal, all represented the institutional recognition that an army was not simply a military instrument, but an extension of the political system that produced it. An army compromised by political corruption could not be made effective by tactical adjustments. The corruption had to be addressed at its source. This lesson, like the others, would be partially forgotten and painfully relearned by subsequent generations. The principle, however, was established at the Wabash. When armies fail catastrophically, the investigation must reach the contracting offices and the cabinet rooms and not stop at the field commander. Sometimes the failure is in the meadow. Sometimes the failure is in the meadow because of decisions made 1,000 miles away. There is a final, harder lesson that the Wabash teaches and that has rarely been incorporated into American military doctrine because it cuts against the assumptions that make the doctrine possible. The lesson is that competence is not the same as victory, and that armies sometimes fail because they were never given the resources to succeed regardless of how well they were led. St. Clair, on the morning of November 4th, 1791, did everything that could be reasonably expected of a 57-year-old man with crippling gout commanding an undertrained, undersupplied, partially deserted army that had been ambushed at dawn in unfortified positions by a numerically comparable force of superior tacticians. He stayed on his feet. He had 3 horses shot from under him. He gave orders. He ordered the breakout that saved several hundred men who would otherwise have died. He survived. None of it was enough. The conditions he had been given to work with did not contain a path to victory. The men who had given him those conditions were 2,000 miles away in Philadelphia, sitting in offices, trading bonds, attending dinners. They were not in the meadow when their decisions matured. The soldiers who paid the price of those decisions were the only people in the meadow when the bill came due. The bones of those soldiers, collected by Wayne's troops in December 1793 and buried beneath what became Fort Recovery, lie now beneath a small Ohio town named for the fortification. There is a state historical site. There is a museum. There are memorials modest in scale, marking the location where between 630 and 657 American soldiers died on the cold morning of November 4th, 1791, along with approximately 200 women and children, whose names mostly were not recorded and whose bodies mostly could not be distinguished from the bodies around them when the burial parties arrived. The site receives a few thousand visitors a year, almost all of them local. The Wabash, unlike Gettysburg or Antietam or even the Little Bighorn, has not been incorporated into the broader national memory of American military history. The disaster was too complete. The lessons were too uncomfortable. The story did not flatter anyone who survived to tell it. American history, like all national histories, prefers victories to catastrophes. The Wabash has been accordingly mostly forgotten. Mostly, but not entirely. In the curriculum of every serious American military institution, the Wabash is studied. The principles it demonstrates are still relevant. The errors it documents are still possible. The asymmetric warfare it exemplifies is still being practiced by adversaries. Yet the United States has been fighting for decades. The Confederacy's half-moon crescent has analogs in modern insurgent ambush tactics. The exploitation of an army's logistics failures has analogs in modern intelligence operations. The targeting of command and control elements is now standard doctrine in every modern army. The Wabash was not an aberration. It was a preview. The lessons it taught were the lessons that asymmetric warfare has been teaching every conventional military force in every century since that has refused to learn them. 3 hours of combat, 1,400 soldiers committed, more than 900 casualties, 21 Confederacy dead. A force the size of a modern infantry brigade destroyed by a force the size of an infantry battalion, using tactics developed in the eastern woodlands over many centuries of warfare. A general who had survived 3 horses being shot from under him, only to be exonerated by a congressional committee and forced to resign anyway. A former Treasury official whose speculation had killed soldiers he had never met, and who would die in a debtor's prison without facing real accountability. A constitutional principle, executive privilege, established in the cabinet meeting that followed the disaster and now invoked in every subsequent dispute between the legislative and executive branches of the federal government. A new army, the Legion of the United States, built from the wreckage and used to win the war the disaster had been part of. A treaty signed at Greenville in 1795 that took most of Ohio from the indigenous nations who had won the most decisive battle they would ever fight against the United States. A mouthful of dirt packed into the lips of dead men as the Confederacy's answer to the question of how much land the Americans were entitled to. The Wabash ended. The consequences did not. They are still being calculated. They are still teaching. They are still waiting in the military history texts for the next generation of commanders and politicians who will need to be reminded that armies are made of men and supplies and intelligence and time, and that the failure of any of these elements can produce, in 3